All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack what is easily one of the most fascinating historical mysteries of all time. We're looking at the strange, twisting journey of how an ancient Egyptian deity somehow transformed into a revered philosopher. A philosopher who essentially shaped Western theology. I mean, it's literally a story of mistaken identity, ancient magic, and a massive chronological error that completely folds some of the greatest minds in history. We're starting off with this shocking question because, remarkably, the fiercely anti-pagan early Christian church universally embraced the writings of what was, at its core, an ancient mythical figure. Now, the early church fathers were definitely known for tearing down pagan idols, right? Yet they carefully preserved the texts of Hermes Trismegistus. So how did a pagan god trick the early Christian church into treating him like a prophet? And this paradox is just brilliantly illustrated in history. If you look at translations like the famous one by John David Chambers, you'll explicitly find Hermes Trismegistus, a deeply pagan symbol, being framed as a Christian Neoplatonist. You literally have the theological works of a pagan deity being printed, studied, and revered as Christian philosophy. To understand how this impossible contradiction even happened, we have to go back and uncover his true identity. Section: The Egyptian deity Thoth. To actually solve this mystery, we've got to rewind. We are jumping back over 3,000 years before the Christian era to find this figure's original identity buried in the sands of antiquity. So in ancient Egypt, the deity Thoth was worshipped as the ultimate fount of wisdom. He was a moon god, the scribe of the gods, and the creator of literal cosmic order. In Egyptian mythology, it was Thoth whose very words called things into being. He was known as the Knowing One, possessing the ultimate magical knowledge. He wasn't just some god of writing. He was the divine mind that structured the universe itself. But, cultures and religions rarely stay in their own isolated bubbles. During the Grecian occupation of Egypt, specifically the Ptolemaic dynasty right before the Christian era, this ancient Egyptian moon god became intermingled with the Greek god Hermes. This mixing, or syncretism, in Hellenic Egypt created a really powerful new hybrid figure. It perfectly blended that deep ancient Egyptian magic and ritual with the incredibly structured Greek philosophical thought of the time. So, this new hybrid figure is eventually crowned with a legendary title, Trismegistus, which translates to thrice great. And this wasn't just a catchy nickname, it signified his absolute mastery across three major domains. He was believed to be the greatest philosopher, the greatest priest, and the greatest king. Basically, he was the ultimate triple threat of the ancient intellectual and spiritual world. In texts from the Hermetic Museum, Hermes explicitly claims this huge dominion. He literally states he has the three parts of the whole world of philosophy. Ancient scholars interpreted this as utter mastery over the three great divisions of the universe: the spiritual, the psychic, and the corporeal realms. Or, if you want to put it in alchemical terms, the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. His wisdom supposedly encompassed literally everything in existence.
The evolution of a name.
So how exactly does a name linguistically evolve into something as grandiose as thrice great? Well, it wasn't an overnight change. It was actually a fascinating linguistic journey. It starts with the famous Rosetta Stone, which uses the repetition megas, 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 great, great, great. In other Egyptian texts, Thoth was sometimes called 8 times great. Then, by the 2nd century, Greek translators mathematically condensed these supreme epithets, where twice great cubed equals 8, into the single enduring Greek name Trismegistus. The great timeline debate, older than Moses? Okay, here is where history takes a seriously wild turn. This evolution of his identity caused a massive chronological error, and we're talking about a mistake that completely altered the trajectory of Western philosophical thought for well over a millennium. Because of his legendary status as an ancient Egyptian king and priest, scholars and religious leaders genuinely believed his texts predated Moses. Some even thought he was a contemporary of Abraham. No way, right? Because in reality, these Hermetic writings, the Corpus Hermeticum, actually emerged much later, right out of the turbulent religious seas of the early Christian era in Hellenistic Egypt. Think about this. For over 1,000 years, everyone from the 2nd century church fathers to brilliant 15th century Renaissance thinkers just accepted this pre-Moses origin as unquestionable historical fact. It wasn't until modern scholars like John Albert Fabricius in the 18th century finally came along and proved these texts were actually much later productions from the times of Porphyry and Jamblichus.
the Christian embrace.
Because of this absolutely epic miscalculation regarding his timeline, early church officials did something highly unusual. They painstakingly preserved these pagan philosophical texts instead of destroying them. They genuinely thought he was an ancient prophet who saw the truth before the Bible was even written. Early Christian writers like Lactantius read these works and enthusiastically praised Hermes. They lauded him for supposedly asserting the majesty of a supreme god, using the exact same terms Christians used, like God and Father, long before Christ even walked the earth. And then you have guys like Cyril of Alexandria going even further. He asserted that Hermes was actively, quote, mindful of the things of Moses. By claiming this, Cyril cemented Hermes's unquestioned status as a divine precursor. The early church was essentially arguing that Hermes had benefited from early divine revelation, granting this completely pagan figure a permanent halo of biblical legitimacy. This belief in his antiquity was so incredibly strong that Clement of Alexandria meticulously documented 42 distinct sacred works of Hermes. 42! And this wasn't just light philosophical reading. When you think about that number, consider that these books covered everything from astrology and astronomy to geology, religious hymns, and the absolute core of Egyptian sacerdotal discipline. He was basically viewed as the foundational author of all world knowledge. Because the ante-Nicene fathers saw these texts anticipating Christianity, they granted the whole structure of Hermeticism this huge second-hand legitimacy. When you look at historical indexes containing the Poemandrus and sacred discourses, they weren't viewed as heretical pagan witchcraft. Actually, scratch that, they were viewed as literal divine foreshadowing. The Church Fathers recognized a systemic truth in those pages that they felt perfectly complemented their brand new faith. Now, this early Christian embrace had massive historical consequences centuries later. When these texts were finally collected and translated into Latin in the 15th century by Marsilio Ficino for the Medici family, it landed like a well-aimed bomb in late medieval Europe. It gave intellectual rebels a powerful weapon to break the stranglehold of scholasticism. It allowed them to reestablish magic, we're talking astrological, alchemical, and magical texts, as a socially acceptable, even Christian spiritual path. Because think about it, if the revered church fathers approved of Hermes, how could his magic possibly be evil? Which really leaves us to ponder this final provocative thought. If this entire philosophical movement, a movement that profoundly influenced the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and Western esoteric thought, was built on a completely misunderstood timeline, does that diminish the true power and value of the Hermetic texts? If the timeline changes, does the truth of the words actually change? It's a fascinating question about how we value wisdom and history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the history you think you know.